Am I mistaken, or he only knocked out 6 rules there, huh? You guys want to do this at my place after? Sure. I don't know if I can quite get all of you, but we'll try. We'll see what we can do. All right, Jordan's just taking a second to just have a glass of water and maybe loosen his tie, and then, I guess we can do a Q&A unless you guys fully got all that. Everybody? Yeah, Q&A? All right. Oh, there he is. Jordan Peterson, everybody. All right, so I sense we're going to have roughly 40 billion questions. There's 2 mics on the sides down here. They couldn't do it for logistical reasons upstairs, but we're told we will call on 1 or 2 of you guys if you speak clearly. But why don't we start? Are we over here? Where am I? Oh, I'm looking right over here. Do try to keep it kind of brief and no major oration, so we can get to as many questions as possible. Take it away.
Good evening. My question is for Dr. Peterson. You referenced in 12 rules, and thank you for your time. You referenced in 12 rules the dragon that gets bigger in small increments if left or if ignored. I was wondering if you thought that it was possible to assume that if certain groups on the left, if they achieved what they felt maybe was equity, could that possibly lead to them wanting to then go further and actually subjugate their political enemies?
The problem with the equity idea is that there's no limit to the number of fractionations you can generate for group identity. So there's an unlimited number of dimensions across which equity might be attained. Problem number 1. Problem number 2 is there's an infinite fractionation of group identity. So it's a problem that can never be solved. So, what groups are you going to make equal?
Can I just a quick follow-up? I guess so just one step further would be then, so if they achieve some type of equity, would they maybe determine that they're not going to be happy until they're in charge of other people?
Well, that question means, well, what's the motivation at the bottom of all this? And I don't believe that the motivation is equity at all. I think the motivation is the upending of the patriarchal tyranny, fundamentally, and that's not the same thing. Those are just mechanisms. Having said that, look, I already stated that inequality is a problem. Inequality drives the left. And fair enough, that's why you need a left wing, is because inequality is actually a political problem. But the radical abolishment of inequality is not a possible goal. There's one thing I did want to say. We actually have a technical problem in our culture. Okay, and it's something that's worth thinking about. So the technical problem is we can draw a border around the radical right. So conservatives can say, okay, here's some people to the right of me, and they're claiming racial superiority doctrines, let's say. Okay, we're going to put them in a box, and we're going to say, you're not us, and we're not playing that game. Okay, right. And that happened with William F. Buckley back in the 60s when he started his conservative movement and dissociated himself from the white supremacists. It's okay, now we know that people can go too far on the right? Those were the Nazis, remember them? And then we know that people can go too far on the left, and those would be the communists and the 100 million people they managed to kill. Okay, so we know that people can go too far on the left. Okay, what's the marker? And the answer is we don't know. And that's not a good enough answer, especially not for people on the left, because they have the same ethical responsibility to dissociate themselves from the dangerous radicals as the conservatives do on the right. But they're incapable of doing it. Now, partly it's technical. It's you can point to racial superiority doctrines on the right, and you can say, no, we're not going there. What exactly do you point to on the left? Because the ideas in their individual form seem, at least harmless, even though they're not. They seem at least harmless, and they have the mask of even something that appears to be beneficial. Now, I think of all the pathological ideas on the left, the most dangerous is equity. I would say when people start talking about equality of outcome, they've crossed the Rubicon. And then it's incumbent on reasonable people in the center and on the left to point that out and dissociate themselves from them. And they're not doing it. And it's not good.
Thank you.
If only there was someone that came from the left that had been trying to do that for these past couple of years.
Ruben report.
Hi, Dr. Peterson.
All right.
I just have to say, I gave up 3 hours of gameplay to come here, and I'm very happy. I'm very happy.
And his question's about Zelda.
Now, here's an interesting spin-off from the JQ that I've been pondering on recently. How do we solve nepotism and in-group preferences in groups with the majority of the power and influence? Is it even a problem at all? By the way, this doesn't have to do anything with race. Any differential factor can be used here.
Well, I mean, I think that we solve the problem of nepotism the way that we have essentially solved it in the West. You know, our bureaucracies, for example, are basically meritocratic. Now, you know, measuring merit is no simple thing, right? Because it's not easy to establish a measurement that actually has a decent correlation with the desired outcome. If it was easy, everybody could set up a successful business. It's actually very difficult. But we have decided, imagine your institution has a function, okay? Which, you know, is not so difficult to imagine. And then imagine people differ in that function, which obviously they will. Then imagine you could measure those differences. Now, we kind of do that. So, for example, if you're applying to university, you might have to take the SAT, because we know that SAT scores roughly sample the same competence domain that university does. Now, it's not perfect by any stretch. In fact, the correlation between SAT scores and grades is about 0.4, something like that. So leaves about 85%, 70%, let's say, of the variance unexplained. But it's objective and neutral, and it's the best that we've got. And so that's what you do, is you reduce people to individuals, first of all, and then you say, well, we're going to assess you in accordance with your competence in relationship to the function of this organization. And that's all we're going to do. And we do that quite well. Now, it's very difficult, and we can't do it perfectly, but there isn't a better solution. And to substitute instead, like, quotas for race and sex is, well, it's impossibly dangerous. It moves us into the identity politics realm, and that subjugates the individual to the group. And that's fine. If you want, like, untrammeled tribalism, then go for it. But we know where tribalism leads. It leads to death. That's where it leads. And maybe that's what you want. So,
all right, why don't we try one up in this section? Anyone over there? Right there.
Hi, Dr. Peterson, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. I recently took your the personality test, and I came out high in neurosis.
Yes.
Can you talk is there any benefit to any sort of negative emotion and anger or perceived withdrawal, or is it just something someone has to sort of try to overcome?
Okay, so the question is, the gentleman who asked the question said he took my personality test and scored rather high in neuroticism, and asked if there was any benefit to that. Well, you know, the answer is it's a normal distribution, right? And so sometimes if you're terrified out of your skull and hiding in the basement, then the king's tyrants don't cut off your head, right? So there are times when the environment is so dangerous that you should be terrified all the time and hide. And like lots of human environments are like that, right? You know, in a Western culture, you might think, well, extroverted and emotionally stable is a pretty good solution. Fair bit of positive emotion, fair bit of verbal assertiveness, not too much fear. It's like, well, if you were like an extroverted and emotionally stable in 1930s in the Soviet Union, you were like dead. So, well, yeah, because like if you're introverted and terrified, then maybe you won't be killed. So it's brutal because you have to put up with the neuroticism, right? You have to put up with the anxiety and maybe with the volatility as well. But in a hyper-dangerous environment, it's an appropriate strategy. So now, having said that, I would also say that if your neuroticism levels are extremely elevated, then there's some possibility that you have an anxiety disorder, or that you're depressed, or that there's something wrong with you physically that you might want to get checked out. So, because there's lots of reasons to be upset and unhappy, and some of them are temperamental, that's just how you're wired, and you can detect that in kids as early as 6 months. But sometimes it's a secondary consequence of, other things that have happened in your life, or general ill health. So I also think I've been puzzling for a long time over why women have higher levels of negative emotion than men. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. It kicks in at puberty, by the way, because it isn't true for boys and girls, but it is true for adult men and women, and it's true throughout the lifespan. I think the reason for it is that the world's actually more objectively dangerous to women at an individual level, partly because they're sexually vulnerable, and also partly because they're physically smaller. So it makes sense that they'd be more nervous. But then also, I think women are more sensitive to negative emotion because they have to be sensitive to the distress of infants. Because it isn't obvious to me at all that female nervous systems are adapted for the individual female. I think they're probably adapted for the infant mother dyad. And you're a lot more vulnerable as an infant mother dyad than you are as an individual. But I mean, you have to be, if you're a good mother, especially of really young infants, when your infant is sleeping and wakes up and goes beep, your right response is to jump out of bed, awake and alert, and go likely nurse the infant. And you have to be on a hair trigger, essentially, to be that sensitive. Well, you pay a price, if you think about it, you pay a price for being sensitive to your infant. Well, why the hell wouldn't you pay a price for that? Because it's really, infants are a lot of work. They require a lot of care. You have to be super attentive to them. They're unbelievably dependent. And so to be wired for that means you're going to pay a price, and maybe it's going to be harder for you to deal with adult males because you're more sensitive to the distress of infants. Highly probable. So these things are, you never get an advantage without paying a price. That's basically the rule from a temperamental perspective.
Right here.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. My name is Giancarlo Patoco. First, I just want to thank you so much for sharing the fruits of your suffering with us and all of the work that you've done. Read about it, love it, appreciate it. Thank you for doing that, sharing the gifts. My question is about technology. I've been doing a lot of thinking about the role of technology in our evolution. It's served an amazing purpose in creating distance between us and nature so that we can survive and live longer. But it seems like we've reached a point at which technology is so deeply embedded in our lives that it is preventing us from living a more meaningful life. And I'm thinking specifically of the fact that we now have these mobile devices that are with us except when we're in the shower and when we're sleeping, basically. And now there are waterproof iPhones, so I don't know what's going to happen next. But we have these phones with us all the time, and they've got social media on them that it seems like it's kind of addictive and distracting us from ourselves and our lives. And it's something that I'm exploring and working on and have transformed my life by taking control over. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the role of technology in our lives and if we've reached a turning point in some ways.
Well, okay, I won't comment specifically on the cell phones. And I think the reason for that is that we're in a place where the rate of technological transformation is so fast that the probability that cell phones will still be the problem in 10 years is zero, right? It'll be something else, and maybe something even more difficult to manage. And so, I talked about this idea that this infinite landscape of potential is opening itself up to us even more right now than it has in the past with this tremendous rate of technological transformation. Well, the question is, the broader question that you have is, how do we deal with this? And that's a great question, and I would say the answer to that is prepare yourself. Because if I say, well, there's a lot going to come at you in the next 10 years. And there's no predicting what it's going to be. It's going to be something that can be used for ill and something that can be used for good. Well, but we can't predict it. So what should you do? And the answer is you should prepare, right? You should eradicate your obvious weaknesses. You should strengthen yourself. You should become more alert and more educated and more disciplined. And you'll do that in your own particular way, and that will make you better whoever you are than you are now. And as a collective, that's the best we've got, because, and I mean this at a really deep level, we have become a planetary transforming force. And that's probably really been true since the end of World War II, right? When we invented the hydrogen bomb. It was like, that was a whole new thing. And we obviously have to develop the wisdom that will enable us to manage that. Because what else are we going to do? Otherwise, we're infants with guns. And one of the things I learned from Carl Jung, what I really liked this, is he was very interested in alchemy, which was a weird admixture of ethics, religion, and proto-science. It was the birthplace of science. And it was kind of a dream. The dream was that human beings could investigate the material world and generate the philosopher's stone, which would make everybody healthy, wealthy, and immortal. But there was a dream there. The dream was we could discover that by investigating the material world. And that was the impetus for the development of science. Well, that took off like mad. And in some sense, we have discovered the philosopher's stone. We are much healthier. We live much longer. We're far richer. And that was all a consequence of investigating the material world. But there was a lot of religious and ethical thinking that was part and parcel of the alchemical dream, and it didn't grow the same way. And so it's like we're stuck ethically in like 1600, and technologically it's the 21st century, and that's not good enough. We have to become as powerful ethically as we are scientifically, or we'll do ourselves in. So. And I think that's part of what we're trying to sort out, is what's our ethical responsibility? How good could we become as individuals? And where could that take us if we decide to go there? So, and cell phones are one small but significant element of that. Incredibly powerful devices, but requiring wisdom in their management. And that's just going to get worse, because there are things coming down the pipes technologically that we can't even imagine. So,
thank you so much.